Welcome to FP&A Fast Track, your source for FP&A resources to put your career on the fast track. Welcome, everyone. I have with me today Christian Wattig. He is a financial planning and analysis expert. He is also an entrepreneur and an educator. He teaches FP&A skills to finance teams and business leaders with his live online course, which is called FP&A Bootcamp. And he's also head of training at DataRails. So with that, I know you have a pretty broad and deep background. So tell us a little bit more in your own words about your background and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, John.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Germany. That's where I grew up. You may hear that in my accent. But I've been living in New York City for the last 10 years. That's where I'm based now. Came here for love. You know, my wife is American. We met when we studied abroad in England. And from a professional career point of view, I spent the first years in consumer goods. So first at Procter Gamble, it's a large consumer goods company, and then at Unilever, also a producer of, ice cream and shampoo, detergent, tea even. And there I did a series of FP&A roles. So that's financial planning and analysis. It's a team inside of the company that handles forecasting, budgeting, getting insights from raw data and presenting them to senior leadership. And I was fortunate to have been able to do a new role every 2 or 3 years because there was a rotational program. And so I partnered with the marketing team, with factories, with the HR team, with the innovation team. And I was very fortunate that every role I've done was closely working with other functions. So that's something I enjoy about FP&A because it's you get a bit of both. You get the puzzle solving aspect of working in spreadsheets and getting into the details, but then you also have the psychology aspect, if you will, of taking those insights that you uncovered and hopefully convincing others to put them into action and to actually taking them with them. And so after actually spent 4 years at P&G, 7 at Unilever, was promoted into leadership roles there. And after doing my MBA, I transitioned into tech because I also wanted to get some experience at smaller companies that are growing and where you can, have an impact more quickly. And so I joined Squarespace. And I was fortunate that I was there leading an FP&A team right around the time when we were preparing to go public. So I helped the CFO get all the planning together, get the story right for how we want to tell it for Squarespace. And when we went public, I learned a lot during the time. It was a great experience. And then I transitioned to DataRails, which is an FP&A software company. And during the time, I also transitioned more and more to teaching because I realized that that's something I'm passionate about. When I was working with my direct reports, I always enjoyed, coaching them, developing them. And I also had the chance to lead the internal learning and development team for finance at Unilever. So I would create courses, about Excel and productivity with Excel, etc. And yeah, that was just great to see how people's eyes light up when they get something, And so I then, because I realized that there is a need for FP&A training because there's a lot that universities don't teach, I created a course on the side, my own passion project, if you will. And it grew into an education company where I'm teaching financial planning and analysis skills to finance teams and business leaders. It's called FP&A Bootcamp. And I also had the opportunity to, in my job at DataRails, move into training. So now I'm internally, I'm teaching my colleagues about FP&A because, it's an FP&A software company. So that knowledge is really important to have. And I also teach customers externally. So it's a really nice synergy there between the work that I do at DataRails and the work that I do at my company at FP&A Prep.
So some of the things about your background that I'm as you were talking, I heard and I kind of sensed some similarities that we have The first of which is you talked about your passion for teaching and like seeing people. I describe to people sometimes I got into training through the back door as well. I was doing FP&A consulting and someone asked me to speak at a conference. And that I just realized when I was in front of a group of people, it reminded me when I was a financial advisor of taking someone from arms crossed and sort of looking at you quizzically like, what, I'm not so sure about what you're talking about here, to sort of leaning forward and their eyes open, like, oh, I think I'm starting to get this and starting to understand and see the value in this. And I never thought until I was in front of people with that happening, I never thought about that part of business at all because I was more the technical guy in Excel. So I'm curious so the two companies that you mentioned, it sounds like at P&G and at Unilever. I'm not as familiar with Unilever, but I worked with a guy when I was a financial advisor who spent, I want to say about 15 years at P&G. And he was constantly talking about how big they were as a company on people development and leadership. And you touched on something. My last guest actually talked about this as well. He worked at the Hartford and he talked about how they had a leadership development program. And it sounds similar to what you described in that there were rotations, right? And as he was describing that, I thought, God, if I could have started my career over and started at a company like that, the way he described it and what you just described sound like so much broader of an experience. And so many people don't get the opportunity to get that exposure to operations. So I'm kind of curious, was there any part of all of those different rotations that you think maybe sort of led into the training part of it you fell in love with?
Yeah, because what I really liked about the rotational program was that it kept my learning curve steep. So after being 2 years in a role, you kind of get familiar with the numbers, with the processes, and you're not learning as much anymore. But then when you get thrown into a new team, yes, there's some things you can take with you, like how to create an Excel spreadsheet. How does the P&L work? How does the balance sheet work? But the business aspect is completely different because you're focusing on a different part of the business. And after doing this a few times, I realized that there's more similarities than I thought around communication, business partnering, because even though the processes and numbers are completely different, you're still running into the same challenges of, okay, how do you get more collaboration? How do you make that more efficient? How do you go about taking data and figuring out what's the insight behind it, for example? And that also, and that really gave me an idea to say, okay, maybe there's something there that I can put together as a program to teach because it seems to be broadly applicable.
Yeah. So one of the things that I talk about a lot with insights is how, especially in FP&A, but I think even more so in all areas of finance and accounting, things are starting to lean more towards automation with a lot of the things that used to be things that FP&A people did as a part of their job. And so I tend to focus a lot more on focusing on developing those insights. So I'm curious in your FP&A bootcamp, for example, because I know that that is a big focus for you. What are some of the things that you talk about in either that role or your training role at DataRails as it relates to helping people improve their ability to develop those insights to then communicate?
Yeah, no, you raised some really good points, and I agree that especially now when automation is growing and also artificial intelligence, right? Tools like ChatGPT can really make a big difference in terms of the kind of work that people are doing. Building those skills like communication and discovering insights is critical because I at least believe that this is where people will still be able to differentiate themselves in accounting and corporate finance, even though we're getting more and more automation. I think this is really where the impact, the areas that will be automated last, because it's that human interaction, right? That human element of having to convince someone that, okay, these are the metrics to look at. And so that's a big focus of my course as well. And the way I'm teaching it is I take reports, similar to ones that I've seen that aren't great, where you have a difference between 1 month to the other in terms of sales, and they're trying to tell a story, but they're not doing it effectively, where they're sharing the data points and then basically telling the person who sees it to say, okay, now you figure out what the insight is here. But where it really comes down to is figuring out what that root cause is, right? So finance shouldn't just say, here are the numbers. We missed our revenue target because of lower promotion volume, for example. That's not a real root cause. It could be a lot of reasons. And what I teach specifically is you need to ask follow-up questions. You need to dig into the numbers and basically don't stop until you reach a certain point. And people keep asking me, okay, when is it enough? When can I stop asking questions and digging into this? And what I found is you can stop when you're at a point where there is a clear action that follows from whatever you discovered. Because, for example, in the case of, we missed our forecast because of a lower promotional volume, could be a lot of things that's driving it. But if you ask follow-up questions and you discover, for example, that the promo team ran an experiment where they have shorter expiration periods on the coupons, and that resulted in lower volume, then there's a story there, and the clear action is, okay, maybe we should revert back to the original expiration period if it had a negative impact on revenue. And that's something that I think is valuable for FP&A teams, because if we can go to business leaders and say, okay, I looked at the numbers, here's something I would recommend you to do, that's much more impactful than if you just say, okay, here are the numbers, and this is the story of how business changed from one period to another one.
Yeah, that's a great point. The clear action identified. I wish that this is one of the mistakes that I used to make early in my career when I was a financial analyst, is my variance analysis explanations didn't tell any story that was any further than one layer deep. So it might be something like revenue was down because average ticket price was down. Okay, you just told me mathematically, you've explained it, but that doesn't really help me answer anything that I can do anything about. So I like the way you make it really clear that that's when you've got to an insight, when you can clearly identify some type of action that can be taken.
Right.
It also reminds me of, you mentioned Chat GPT, and I've played around with Chat GPT for helping me do research on different things, like when I'm developing a new course. And one of the things I keep hearing people talk about, especially even the AI experts, is that at least in the current version of Chat GPT, one of the areas where it tends to not be so great is that the quality of the questions and sort of how you're directing the questions and the follow-up questions that you're using determine the quality of the output that it gives you. And so I've heard people use different examples where they give kind of a vague question, and then they get a very vague feedback back from it. And one of the things that I used to talk about a lot is the experience that you have that has nothing to do with the numbers in the general ledger or in any of the reports. That's the context that can help you be much more valuable, because that context from, let's say, for example, just getting out of your department and walking around and seeing the operations of the business, that's what helps you understand and connect the dots. When you see the numbers and you understand the operations, that's what helps you bridge the gap where even ChatGPT and AI, they may not have that data because it's not in a database anywhere, right?
Right. Right.
So you used another term, business partnering, it's kind of been a buzzword for quite a while now, but help me understand in your terminology, how you describe business partnering and why that is such a big area of focus for a lot of organizations.
Sure. So, if you look at any organizations, there are silos, right? There's the marketing team and the sales team. Their goal is to get more prospects. There's the sales team who takes those prospects, turns them into maybe hopefully paying customers. There's the R&D team that develops the product, and so on. And they all have different goals. They all have different incentives, and that's fine. That's how companies work. But and then of course you have the executive team who sits on top of that. But FP&A and finance, when they're real business partners, they can be a connector, and I think that's very important because if you keep the information in silos, then there's a risk that people overemphasize certain goals because they're on their scorecard but not on others, which can harm the company overall because then it gets out of balance. Or people don't see solutions to a problem because they just look at it from their lens. They just look at it from their perspective. And if you have effective FP&A team, they have the bird's eye view, because they can see how everything comes together in the profit and loss statement, and they dig into the numbers, they explain them, they understand the strategy, and so they can connect the dots and understand, okay, where can we help each other? How can we put all this together and tell a bigger story? Or to give another very specific example, once you have the revenue, it's already kind of too late, right? It's a lagging indicator. If you want to figure out how to be more proactive about your business, how to be more forward-looking, you also need to look at operational KPIs that don't have a dollar value attached, right? And you don't get them from your financial systems. You have to talk to your business partners. You have to understand, okay, how do they look at the business? For example, you could look at things like traffic to your website, right, as an early indicator of how could my revenue, if you have an online business, change later on. And that's where business partnering comes in.
Yeah, and so you actually mentioned something there that when I think about the business partnering that I used when I was actively working in FP&A for typically companies similar to like what you're talking about, just size-wise, right? So like when I worked at Royal Caribbean Cruises, for example, that getting around to the different operational areas of the company gave you some of that background that you needed. But what you were talking about reminds me as well of when I talk about presenting numeric information in one of the courses that I talk about, everyone always seems to think immediately numeric financial, right? Where in reality, a lot of those numbers on dashboards are either a combination of financial metrics and non-financial metrics. They're still numbers, right? But they're not necessarily financial numbers. One of the examples that I thought of when you were talking was in the reservations department in Royal Caribbean Cruises. One of the metrics they used to look at for reservations agents was what they call talk time, right? So they used to get reports that would actually show the amount of time that they were on each call. And when reservations was one of the departments that I supported, so I did their budgets for them and their monthly financial analysis. And it kind of was a light bulb that went off when I spent some time in that department. And I actually watched some of the reservation agents taking calls. And then I would look at some of the metrics and realize why sometimes they went outside of the sweet spot of what was supposedly the ideal talk time. And sometimes it could be something as simple as the person that they were talking to was older. So they literally needed to slow down. They needed to talk more slowly. The person they were talking to was not very tech savvy. So sometimes they would have to back up a little bit and explain things in a little bit more detail. And at the end, you would look at a different metric from talk time, and maybe they actually upsold them on something because they were educating them. But if you only looked at that one metric, like talk time, for example, it looked negative, but by understanding the operations, it led you to go, okay, I know that one metric might look negative, but let's look at these 2 or 3 other metrics to get a bigger picture for things.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that I wonder in some companies that don't proactively have programs like the one you talked about where you have different rotations. I was fortunate to work in some companies where we didn't have formal programs to do that. I just happened to have bosses that were just a little bit more kind of open-minded to say, look, I trust you that you know how to do your job. So if you're telling me you need some time to go out into the operations to do X, Y, and Z, they just kind of let me do that. And obviously, if I came back and it was clear that I was wasting time, that, they would have reeled that in, but they could quickly see where the benefit was coming from spending that time. So
Yeah.
what, go
And
ahead.
if you don't have, to your point, if you don't have a rotational program, what you can do and what I would recommend people do if they want to do more business partnering, develop more business understanding, going out there and asking questions, right? I think that's really the big differentiator. And but when I give people this advice, they sometimes come to me and say, but if I go there and ask them questions, am I not bothering them? They're busy. I'm not taking time away from their work. And that's the wrong way to look at it, because if you ask the right questions, you're actually helping people by helping them think outside the box and looking
Yeah.
at the issue from different angles. So it's actually um, you're doing people a favor if you ask the right questions. It's not something that bothers them, and that can really make a big difference. And people are curious what I would recommend in terms of what should I ask people. Just go to someone you're working with in another department and say, hey, what would you like to know to make better decisions? And when would you want to know that? And then, they may mention
Mm.
something, and then that could be something that you can give them potentially, that you can go out, look at the systems, look at how can you get that number, that metric that they want. And that then shows them that you want to do more than just crunch the numbers. And it can be a great beginning for a professional relationship.
Yeah, that's a great tip. You reminded me of another thing that I often tell people, especially in FP&A, which is you oftentimes have access to data that could be very helpful to people that you support, but they aren't even aware that you have that data. So only
Right.
by having those relationships and asking questions like you just articulated, can you actually help them even more. And the better the relationship, the more conversations you have, the more questions you ask, the better you have the ability to help and support those folks. You mentioned asking questions, which sort of begs a question on my end, which when I talk about communication, I think one of the core key skills is listening, which is much harder to do well than most people realize if they haven't really worked on it. So I'm curious, do you have any tips for people, especially FP&A folks, for being good listeners in that capacity and supporting others in the analysis that they do?
Yeah. I had a fantastic mentor at Unilever, and he is really one of the best listeners I ever worked with. So what he would do is, he asked me a question. I I answer it as best I could, and then he would paraphrase it. So he would basically repeat back to me what I said in his own words. And that I felt is something that more people should do, because I feel like it does a few things, right? It makes sure that you understand each other, because sometimes there's this sender receiver problem where you think, oh, it's clear in my head, so it must be clear in the other person's head too, when sometimes it isn't. And it shows that the other person really listened, of course, if you paraphrase it correctly. And it gives you time to think your own answer through again. And maybe that's the biggest unlock there, because sometimes when you hear what you just said repeated back to you, you realize, oh, actually, no, I missed something. I should add something here to improve the decision. Um, and then the other thing that he would do that I found really helpful was, let's say he disagreed with something that I said. He wouldn't say, I disagree with you, you should do it differently. He would ask me a follow-up question that kind of helped me then, with more and more questions, helped me figure out myself that I'm on the wrong path. And I think that that's really powerful, because it empowers the other person to um, come up with the right answer themselves, rather than telling them, no, I know this better than you, you're wrong, you should do it
Yeah.
this way. And to me, that's part of good listening.
Yeah. That also to me speaks a lot to leadership, right? As opposed to just telling someone what to do, leading them to come to their own conclusion that that thing that maybe you might want them to do, that you might want to lead them to do, in fact, is the right thing in their mind because they've thought through it. thanks to your questions and your conversation with them. Um, and it builds a lot more buy-in, right? So to your point, like if he asked you questions and you said something along the lines of, how do you think we should do this? And now you develop the plan and you're literally selling them back on your plan. And then they say, you know what, that sounds like a great plan. Let's do that. Now you kind of almost by default, you've taken ownership of that because you're the one that came up with the plan. So there's some brilliant leadership kind of baked into that, those
Right.
listening skills that you were talking about. Um, it also reminds me a little bit of, I talked when we talk about communication about empathy. And I think sometimes people confuse different types of empathy. So I talk more about what a psychologists refer to as cognitive empathy more than emotional empathy. And so for clarity, in a business setting, when I'm talking about empathy, it's much more about making the person you're speaking with feel understood. It's not so much about like maybe in a personal relationship where you want to feel what that person's feeling, right? Or you want to figure out if that's something you agree with and you want to get on board with. Because in business settings, there are times that we may not agree with the other person. We may not want to go down the same road that they're going down, but we always want to make them feel heard and understood. And so sometimes just feeding that back to them is, as you phrased it, in a way that makes them say, that's right, this guy gets me, he understands. That in a business setting oftentimes is as much empathy as we need to have to keep that business relationship working so that we can collaborate effectively. Uh,
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. In fact, when I teach business partnering and the basics of that, I teach it this way. Business partnering is essentially the cross section of empathy and business acumen, business understanding. And not, like you said, empathy in the sense of we need to empathize with someone's feelings, but being able to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person and look at the business the way that they're looking at it, and really understanding what are the goals, what do they care about, what drives them, how do they influence the business. And yeah, so 100% agree.
so another thing that I'm curious about, a lot of what you have talked about in not just in specific examples, but even just that overall sort of rotational program that you were a part of, it sounds to me like you got a lot of awareness about different areas of the business that a lot of people won't get if they're just sitting in their cubicle or in their office and they're just crunching numbers. So I'm curious, have you in your career, have you had specific questions that you have asked yourself that have triggered awareness of something that you found really helpful? Are there any that seem to be like they're things that you see as questions that seem to pop up from time to time that are sort of repeating throughout your career?
It's a good question. One of the things that I ask myself and that I found helpful is, okay, it seems like I have an idea of how I want to approach it, but let's pause for a second and ask myself, are there more options? Are there different ways to approach the situation? And it could be about a professional relationship, how I respond maybe to a challenging email, or it could be about, which type of financial model do I use? And what I found is that often people, and myself included, rush to the first solution that comes to mind quickly because they feel like, okay, I got it. I have the idea. I know how to do this. I've done this before. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be better options out there. And what I learned is that when you sit down with a piece of paper and you just start writing down different approaches to the problem and you get to 3, 4, 5, all of a sudden, like your brain kind of gets in this creativity mode and you come up with things that you wouldn't have seen before. And it happened more than I can count that I felt like, okay, I'm really happy I did that because the option number 3 that I came up with is much better than the option number 1 that I would have gone with had I not paused and slowed down.
Yeah, you just hit on something that I've seen a lot, which is sometimes being in finance and accounting roles, especially the fresher you are out of school, because right when we're in college and we're taking courses and we're taking all these standardized tests, we start sort of getting conditioned to this convergent thinking. right? That there's one correct answer, right? And we're trying to sift through the data, find what the relevant data is, and then converge on that one correct answer. But in the real world, oftentimes there isn't one correct answer that just always kind of pops up. So sometimes it requires what you described, that sort of divergent thinking, to sit down and think, all right, I don't have a preset answer that I'm trying to find. I'm just thinking about, and then maybe you have a particular methodology that you use, but generally speaking, just the idea that we're not trying to find the one correct answer, but the brainstorming like you talked about. And I think the more we can get people to think outside the box and use that sort of more divergent thinking and brainstorm a little bit more, I think once people have done it a handful of times, they start to see the value in it. And then we don't have to sell them on the idea so much. They'll just kind of do it reflexively. But sometimes, especially early in my career, I felt like I was always just trying to look for the one correct answer until one of my bosses would throw out an idea about what about this, what about this? And I kind of had to learn almost the hard way by having someone else sort of feed me ideas to kind of get into that more divergent type of thinking. There's lots of different exercises actually that are out there to help with that. Uh,
Yeah, and I think in some ways, school is really not preparing us well for that, because when you do a test in school, you learn that there's always one correct answer. If you don't get the
yeah,
exact right answer, you lose points, right? And nobody wants to
yeah,
use points. Everyone wants a straight A, and that's the exactly wrong mindset for going into business, right? First
yeah,
of all, like you said, you need to be able to recognize that sometimes there isn't one correct answer, there could be multiple. And it's also not about getting 100% all the time, right? 80-20
yeah,
thinking, and thinking about, okay, what's the 80%? What's the 20% that I can put in that gives me 80% there to my goal
yeah.
is super critical. And I feel like it's not taught, it's not really emphasized in the way school works right now.
I'm curious too. So what you just said makes me think about culture, right? And that culture that you never want to be wrong. And I unfortunately have worked in some of those environments where if you said something that was not perceived as the right answer, you felt very on the spot. And sometimes it almost felt like it was met with sort of a dismissive sort of a response. And I think some of that is cultural. Right? And there are lots of cultures where they emphasize it's okay to be wrong, right? Sometimes we have to be wrong two or three times before we find a good answer. Might not be the only right answer, but I think sometimes, especially if you come, like I came from public accounting first before I got into FP&A, and that was much more a world of right and wrong, right? Especially if you're doing audits or you're talking about taxes, things are much more rigid. And so I think sometimes I forget who it was that said it, but I probably Peter Drucker, one of these management gurus, that said culture eats business planning for lunch every day of the week, right? And the whole idea was if you have the right culture and you're teaching people not what to think, but more a little bit how to think, and sometimes outside of the box, that can be more useful. And so I'm curious when it comes to FP&A. I know when I was sitting in that seat in FP&A, there were a lot of misconceptions that people in other departments had about those of us that worked in FP&A. Are are there any misconceptions about what you do or what FP&A generally does that you think are big misconceptions that you might be able to help people kind of dispel and get straight?
Yeah. So one misconception is that FP&A is a back office function, right? And there are some aspects of, okay, we need to get the numbers from the system, we need to clean it up, we need to put it into our models, and maybe it takes some time to get that right and crunch the numbers. But the majority, that's only a small part of it. The majority of how we're adding value, even though unfortunately it's not always how we spend most of our time on, is taking that insight and discussing it with other departments to see how does it actually help them? How does that actually help them make a change to how they're doing things, right? And to hopefully to the better. And that requires, what we discussed, understanding where they're coming from. But it also requires buy-in from the leadership team. And that's, to your earlier point about culture and how that impacts the process. You need to have a leadership team that recognizes that finance FP&A is more than a back office function and puts people in the room where decisions are made, right? If you're never able to join those meetings where it's being discussed what we're doing with the numbers, it's very difficult to learn how to make those recommendations and how to get there. So you need the support, and if you don't have it, you need to ask for it from your leadership and say, hey, I think I can do more. Can I maybe join this operational meeting? Can I join the board, maybe not the board meeting, but the prep meeting for the board meeting, where we put all the story together, etc. And people are sometimes scared to ask for this, but I've managed teams myself, and I always found that when someone comes to me and says, hey, I want to do more than what I'm doing in my current role, I want to have a bigger impact, I want to broaden my role a bit if I can you help me do that? That's always something that I was happy to support and happy to see, how can I make that happen for that person.
So you actually just answered a question that I was going to ask as a follow-up, which is, if I get this a lot when I talk about culture, sometimes people will speak up and say, well, I'm not in a leadership position, so I don't set the culture. So, what really can I do as a junior person? I think you just hit the nail on the head, which is be proactive, ask, raise your hand, identify yourself. And then sometimes I'll get pushback where people say, well, what if I get shot down? Well, if you're consistently getting shot down when you're literally trying to do more and add more value, maybe you need to reevaluate if that's the right company culture for you. And
Right.
maybe some of those things start to add up and become a little flag that goes off that says, well, maybe this isn't where I want to plant my flag long-term for a career. Maybe I need to find some place where I'm better as a cultural fit, where when I raise my hand and say, I want to do more, they look at that and go, oh, wow, we want more people like that. They want to contribute more. And unfortunately, sometimes when people are in those more junior roles, it can be a little bit intimidating. So I'm curious, when you were in more junior roles, did you feel a little bit intimidated to raise your hand and sort of volunteer for more things? Or were you fortunate to have mentors, like you mentioned, that were more receptive to that?
Yeah, that really comes. I worked in different roles, different teams also inside of larger companies, and that really came down to psychological safety. I don't know if that's a term that I'm sure you're familiar with it. Just for those who aren't, psychological safety means, do you have the ability to make mistakes, right, and own those mistakes? You have the ability to speak up without being shut down, and you feel like your voice is heard. And in the end, it comes down to trust. Do you trust your leadership team? Do you trust your boss? Do you trust the boss of your boss? And when that trust isn't there, it's very difficult. And you may maybe raise your hand once, but if you feel like if you get the cold shoulder, it can be tough as a junior person. And that's where I agree with you that you need to think about, is this an environment that I can continue to be successful, or do I maybe want to ask, to maybe make a move inside of the company or to a different company? But the important thing is, I also unfortunately saw people who just never who give up, and then they just resign and say, okay, I guess I just have to continue doing my manual number crunching here, and then they just put the head down and keep working. But that doesn't really get them anywhere, because if you don't raise your hand, and sometimes it takes the leadership team more than once to realize, what's going on. People are busy, they have a lot of other issues that they're dealing with. So if you raise your hand once and you feel like people aren't listening to you, don't hesitate, do it a second or maybe even a third time. And that may be when people realize, oh, here's someone who wants to contribute, who wants to do more.
Right. Yeah, that you hit on something that I really got this ingrained even more when I started following the gentleman I was talking to you about earlier, the behavior panel guys, because they always talk about, we're looking for patterns here, right? So if we see somebody do something once, that doesn't necessarily tell us something concrete about that behavior or what that might mean for that person. We're looking for patterns. And to them, by definition, we want to see it at least 3 times or more before we even call it a pattern, before we even start drawing any conclusions about it. You mentioned psychological safety, and it reminds me of, so I always thought about whenever I felt like I needed to have conversations with someone where it was really important that we had good rapport for that conversation. Maybe it was a review, or maybe it was just some kind of a conversation that I thought might be a little bit of a tough conversation. Um, there's a few things that I always did that I felt like maybe helped with that rapport to make the conversation flow a little better. One of them, for example, might be to literally have that conversation while we're walking. There's a lot of psychology behind this. You've probably seen political leaders do this, where they're literally just walking and they're having these conversations, or have the conversation where you're sitting at a table where it's not putting you where you're diametrically opposed to them, right? Like a physical barrier in between, like a round table or something like that. Something where you're sharing a cup of coffee or a meal, where it sort of builds in these additional aspects of a little bit of it being culture that already start to make things feel a little more comfortable before you're even getting into the conversation. And I'm wondering, do you have any tactics or tips that you've used to help build in some of that psychological safety in those conversations?
Yeah, actually, Steve Jobs, I've been told, was a big fan of walking meetings too. He would do a lot of walking meetings. That's interesting. I had a few of those myself as well. I'm in New York City now. It's not always that nice to walk through. Midtown is very busy, very loud.
Right.
So unfortunately, I can't do that now. But um, yeah, no, actually, I realized that sometimes when you, especially with a more junior person, maybe a person who reports to you, you go in a meeting room, you sit across from each other, it can come across as very formal, even though you don't want it to, right? Even though you try. So I found that if you go maybe in the cafeteria, maybe even over lunch, and then you bring up a topic, people are more relaxed and are more open to listening and thinking about things differently. And for you as the leader, it's easier to communicate that, hey, I'm not criticizing you as a person. I'm giving you this feedback, or I'm giving you this comments because I want to help you, and I think you can learn from this.
Yeah, that's the last thing you said is really important and something people don't do enough, which is however you want to word. There's lots of different ways you could word it, but the general idea being, look, I wouldn't even be giving you this feedback if I didn't think you had a lot of potential. And you don't need to completely change. I used to hear it referred to, and this is going to sound very old fashioned, but carburetor adjustments, right? But cars don't have carburetors anymore. But back in the day, when what people would call a shade tree mechanic would work on a car, sometimes they would make the tiniest little adjustment to the carburetor, which would make a big difference in the performance of the vehicle. And many times, if you just kind of preface the feedback in that way, that, look, I see this potential with a little bit of a tweak, I could see where you could really kind of take off and get to that next level. Just the
Right.
way you frame it makes a big difference.
Huge
Um,
difference. Yeah.
I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about your FP&A bootcamp. But before we do that, I want to kind of backtrack to something, which is when I look at my own career and my path to getting into FP&A and then getting into training, it was very circuitous. So I'm always curious. I'm just naturally a curious person. I'm curious, when was the first time that you identified in your mind that you wanted to do something in finance? What was that path like, and sort of leading you to finance in general before we get
hmm
to the boot camp aspect of it?
Yeah. So before I decided to study business, I actually for a long time, I wanted to study psychology. But then I thought, okay, I don't want to every day deal, with people's problems. I thought that it could, impact me over time. And so I looked into organizational psychology. But then I thought, oh, then I have a really narrow career path in human resources. Ended up studying business. But then when I studied business, for those of you who don't have a degree in business, it's very broad. You learn a lot of different things about how companies are run, about leadership, about financial management. And when I first took my finance classes, I realized I really enjoy building something in Excel. Going into the software, creating a model, and then it combines all these inputs, and in the end, there's one output. Be it a return on investment or maybe net present value. It tells you something about, is this a good idea or a bad idea? I found it super interesting. And at the same time, I was looking for something where I could work with people. I can, collaborate with people. And because the psychology aspect always interested me. And so when I realized that, hey, okay, good, there's accounting, that could be interesting, but there's this other thing called FP&A where you're actually where I can do both, doing the work in the spreadsheet and the analysis and the analytics there, and working with people. I found, wow, that's a really cool cross-section of a lot of things that I'm interested in.
That is such a better way of arriving at what you wanted to do than my path. My path actually was almost backwards. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I thought someday I wanted to have my own business. So I thought, okay, something in business. And then it just seemed to me like the hardest major within business was accounting. So I thought, well, if I can master that, then I should be okay with the rest of the stuff. And so that's kind of what led me to accounting. And then eventually I kind of branched off into finance in some other areas. But I want to talk a little bit about your FP&A bootcamp, because one of the things that I'm curious about is, what was it that led you to the idea of creating that in the first place? And then I want to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of what's in the FP&A bootcamp. But what was the genesis of creating the course in the first place?
Yeah, so I had a chance to lead the learning and development team at Unilever, where I created, some programs, mostly Excel focused, for my finance team. And then afterwards, I went back to doing FP&A, and for a long time, I didn't really think about it as much. But then I saw randomly, this company. They're called Maven. It's a startup, Silicon Valley startup, and they're creating a marketplace for cohort-based courses. So those are courses that are taught live over Zoom. And until then, I always thought, when you create an online course, it's pre-recorded, which doesn't have that direct interaction with people. But when I saw that there's a different way to teach online, which is, over Zoom and live, I jumped on the opportunity. And I was really fortunate that I noticed that I saw what they were doing, because they taught me how to, take what I know as a subject matter expert and turn it into something, into a course, into a curriculum that is interactive, that has all these active elements. It has the community element. And yeah, I'm really grateful for that, because they gave me fantastic coaching, fantastic training and support along the way of creating this course. And now, in the last year, over 200 people took FP&A bootcamp. So I'm over the moon in terms of how it grew and how successful it was. So yeah, I'm really grateful about having had the opportunity to get that training.
So speaking of grateful, I'm grateful to you that you did that, because I just started digging into creating a course on Maven myself. And it was
congrats.
because I saw your course. Exactly what you described is what made me look deeper at it. I thought, because I've for a long time thought about creating recorded courses, more so because of the business model, because trading time for money, to me, it's one of the worst business models ever, right?
Yep.
But recording a course and just putting it up there, to me, detached me from the thing about training that was my favorite part, right? Which was actually working directly with people. So when I saw your course on Maven and saw that cohort based and the way they structure it, I started digging in more. And so now I'm actually going to look at putting a course up there myself, which we could talk about later. I'd love to pick your brain, but that would be for another conversation. So one of the things I'm really interested in is within FP&A. I know you spoke at the last AFP National Conference in Philadelphia, right? And next time we'll have to catch up at the conference, because we missed each other at that particular conference. But I've been working with AFP for going on 10 years now, and I know they have that FP&A certification course, which has this very specific body of knowledge. So I'm curious, how did you decide on the specific things you were including in your FP&A bootcamp? And does it map at all to the AFP FP&A certification body of knowledge?
It's a great question because I recently talked to a student of FP&A Bootcamp of my course who also did the AFP certification. So she did both. So my course, basically what I tried to do is, what would I have wanted to know, 10 years ago when I started out in FP&A that really helped, that would have helped me hit the ground running, really figure out some of the hard lessons that I had to go through trial and error, and basically speed up the process of the 4 pillars of FP&A. What I think the 4 pillars of FP&A are, which is financial storytelling. So how do you take your data, turn it into insights, turn it into a story, and tell it effectively? Business partnering, which we touched on today as well. How do you develop professional relationships? How do you build rapport? How do you figure out how to help people get a seat at the table where decisions are made, and at the same time create accountability and budget discipline, which is also things that we have to do in finance. And the third pillar is forecasting and planning. So I believe that a budget process is more than just having a P&L and a balance sheet on a piece of paper, because it's going to be outdated a few months after you submit it, if not sooner. And so the way I teach it is, how do you set up the process so you can benefit from it now later on down the line, by setting up an organizational learning process, essentially, where you compare your actuals to your budget. And if you've done your budget right, you can get insights from that. The third workshop is budgeting forecasting. And the final workshop is about financial modeling. So how do you set up a financial model? What are the different financial model types for decision support? And how do you build the model, not just in Excel, but the process starts much earlier. How do you get the right assumptions from people? How do you get the right inputs? How do you sense check those inputs? And then how do you build the model with a focus on fast iteration? Because I think anyone can build a complex model, but if it takes you 2 hours to answer a simple question, then you haven't really mastered it. So we talk about how can you set up the model so that you're in a meeting, your boss asks you something, you can give them the answer right away. So yeah, and the way I'm doing it is I firmly believe that if I were to lecture for 2 hours straight, then people would just forget half of it, 2 weeks later. So I have a lot of breakout room discussions during the workshops, and even some role plays that people told me they really enjoy, and some quizzes, case studies, etc. And now comparing it to the AFP program, it's a completely different approach. FP&A Bootcamp is 4 workshops. Each workshop is 2 hours long, 2 Q&A sessions, so it's very condensed. And the AFP certification, I think, is 30 hours or something like that, or 40 hours of video courses. Yeah, it goes much more into the theory, which can also be a good foundation. Whereas my course is more about what are the practical elements that you can go and apply right away. Now, the AFP certification is video-based, that you can do at your own pace, whereas my course is live and engaging and interactive. And when I talked to my students, she actually said that, who took both, AFP and FP&A Bootcamp, she said that they're actually complementary, because the AFP certification gives you a good foundation of the theory, and it's very broad and comprehensive in that regard. Whereas FP&A Bootcamp is more about, okay, what are the practical insights for all these 4 pillars in FP&A that help you solve these problems, and that you can apply right away from an application point of view.
Yeah, something you said, and I think we touched on it before we started rolling, but I've heard this elsewhere. There's some famous quote, something along the lines of, plans are not always very useful, but planning is critical, right? And it's that idea that and I've said this for years and years, especially when I work for big companies, and we do an annual plan. Sometimes we do a 5-year strategic plan. And then, 20 years ago, we print everything out, right? And we used to joke that the second that last page rolled off the printer, it was almost useless, right? Because things change so quickly. The plan was not the point. It was the process of planning and what it forced us to ask and answer along the way in crafting the plan is where the real value was. Um, and something you said as well, uh, years ago at one of the conferences that I went to, Alight Planning was a sponsor. And they did a demo of their software. And their big selling point back then was it enables you to do what if analysis on the fly so that instead of saving one or two or maybe three scenarios, you can build it in such a way that you could be in the middle of a meeting. And when the CFO or whoever it is says, what if, you can write on the fly, change a few variables, and without destroying your model, because of the way it was built, answer a lot of those what ifs in great detail, right? Because the way the model was constructed, all the way down to maybe EPS 5 years from now, right? Which many years ago was very difficult, if not impossible to do. But with the tools that we have now, if you craft it properly, is much easier to do. Um, do you touch on rolling forecasts? Do you use rolling forecasts in what you do?
Yeah. So during the workshop that touches on budgeting, we also focus on forecasting, which is the natural extension. Once you have your plan, your budget, you forecast, and you flex it every month or quarter. And rolling forecast is something that I think also many companies don't do enough, because traditional forecast, you forecast until the end of the year, and then usually, let's say that's December. In November, you only forecast 2 months. And then when you do the plan for the next year, you start from scratch. But it's much easier to do this if you always forecast, say, 12 or 16 months, no matter where you are in the year. And then doing the planning for the next year, you don't have to start from zero. You already have something as a baseline. And, that makes a big difference. We also talk about, driver-based planning, scenario planning, zero-based budgeting, all those different approaches, and not just what they are all about, but also why would you do them, in which context would you do them, what are the pros and cons of those. It's a big focus of that workshop as well.
Yeah, I think the first time somebody gave a talk about rolling forecasts, I kind of sat there thinking, why would we do this any other way? It almost seems contrarian to think that the closer we get to the end of the year, the less planning we're doing for the remainder, like the most important part that where we're going to try to make up for anything we missed in the plan, right? We had a shortfall and now we only have a few more months to go, and we're doing less planning, less forecasting, less analysis in terms of the time frame that we're looking at. The first exposure I had to it, it almost seemed ludicrous that everybody didn't do rolling forecasts always. And then you mentioned driver-based planning. I think because my first exposure to planning was in an M&A context. So we were only doing driver-based planning because we wanted to be able to do what ifs a million different ways. And you couldn't do that if you didn't build your model using the right drivers. And it's just interesting sometimes how context really colors how you look at things, right? I just thought driver-based planning was the only way to do it because that was my first exposure to it.
Yep.
So we're right up on the hour now, and I want to make sure that I respect your time. But before we go, I want to make sure that we tell everybody, how do they find, number one, your FP&A bootcamp, and then number two, how did they reach you? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so you can Google FP&A Bootcamp. We can probably also put the link in the show notes, right?
Yep,
you can go
absolutely.
to fpaprep.com/course. But people, can also follow me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I post usually 5 to 7 times a week because, not everyone can afford my course, and I want to be able, and I want to help as many people as possible. So I share a lot of what I learned over the years on LinkedIn as well. So feel free to follow me there, and I'm always happy to connect with people in the finance space and exchange notes.
And for those of you who have not followed him before, I can tell you from all the FP&A experience that I have, even just the free stuff that you see that you put out through LinkedIn, there's a lot to learn, even just your posts on LinkedIn, even if they never buy your course. But if you're in FP&A, what you mentioned, I think was brilliant, that this course is complementary to what AFP offers, right? So even if you're pursuing that credential and all that with ASP, I've worked with them for 10 years. great organization, great stuff, but this is complementary, right? Which I think was very smart for the way you put it together, but also makes it that much more useful for everyone that's out there. So with that, I want to go ahead and wrap up. Everybody, if you don't subscribe to the channel, please subscribe, hit your notification bell, find Christian in social media, and tune in to our next episode, and we'll see you there. Thanks, everybody.